Step into the Wild West, where legends are born and blood stains the dust. Don't forget to subscribe and ride with us through history's deadliest tales. Making of a legend. The sun was merciless over the Arkansas River Valley in the early 1840s, the year a boy named Bass Reeves was born into bondage. His first breath was not his own, for he belonged to another man. He would grow up in the cruel rhythm of slavery, sunrise to sunset, sweat and pain, no future to call his own. Yet in the boy's eyes burned something that chains could not dim, a fire that seemed to say, "Someday I will ride free." Bass was taught to work the land, tend horses, and serve in silence, but he listened closely to the men around him, especially the elders who whispered songs of Africa, the scriptures, and stories of freedom. He learned the cadences of different tongues, memorized faces and gestures, and sharpened a mind that saw more than most gave him credit for. Even in those early years, people said Bass had an uncanny presence. Quiet, watchful, a boy who could vanish into a crowd or appear at your side without a sound. When the Civil War erupted, Reeves's enslaver, a man named George Reeves, brought him along to fight for the Confederacy. Bass, forced to serve, cooked meals and tended to his master's camp. But war was chaos, and chaos sometimes opens doors. One night, after a bitter argument, Bass struck his master, escaped the camp, and vanished into the dark wilderness. He did not run blindly. Bass disappeared into Indian Territory, the land of the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. There, among people who knew what it meant to live on the edge of survival, Bass found refuge. He absorbed their customs, learned their hunting skills, and spoke their languages. He became a tracker of uncanny ability, able to read signs in the earth like a book. Broken twigs, disturbed soil, the faintest footprint in dust. Among the tribes, he was not a slave, but a man. For years, Bass lived in the frontier's shadow, a fugitive, but also a student of the land. He could ride for days without losing direction, stalk a deer without a sound, and shoot with a precision that men would later call supernatural. Some whispered he had the instincts of a wolf. Others said he was blessed by something divine. The truth was simpler. Bass Reeves had survived, and in surviving, he had transformed. When the war ended and the Union prevailed, Reeves emerged not as a fugitive, but as a free man. He built a modest life in Arkansas, farming with his wife and raising a family. But the frontier was no place for peace. The Indian Territory was a haven for outlaws, horse thieves, murderers, and bandits who believed no law could reach them there. Towns lived in fear, ranchers carried rifles in the fields, and sheriffs in nearby settlements often refused to cross into that lawless land. It was here, in this crucible of violence and opportunity, that Bass Reeves's destiny found him. In the late 1870s, Judge Isaac Parker, the infamous hanging judge of Fort Smith, Arkansas, sought men brave or mad enough to enforce the law in Indian Territory. Most deputies refused, knowing it was a death sentence, but Parker needed someone who knew the land, the languages, the ways of the tribes. He needed someone unshakable, incorruptible, and fearless. Bass Reeves was the man he chose. When Reeves pinned on the silver star of a deputy U.S. Marshal, history shifted. He was one of the first black lawmen in the American West, a living contradiction in a country still bleeding from war. White settlers doubted him, outlaws mocked him, but soon fear replaced laughter. They learned quickly that Reeves was not a man to cross. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like cold iron, Reeves cut an unforgettable figure astride his horse. He carried 2 Colt revolvers, worn low on his hips, and a Winchester rifle slung across his saddle. His weapons, however, were only tools. What made Bass truly dangerous was his mind. He could remember every detail of a face, every word spoken, every lie told. He could track a man for days without rest, using signs invisible to others. And when the moment came, he was as patient as a wolf waiting for its prey to step into the open. By the 1880s, Bass Reeves was already a name whispered in saloons and outlaw camps. Some said he rode with spirits, others that he could not be killed by mortal bullets. Mothers warned their sons, "If you cross the law, Bass Reeves will come for you." But Reeves was not a ghost. He was a man who had risen from slavery to wear the badge of justice, and his story was just beginning. In a world where lawmen often blurred into outlaws, where sheriffs looked the other way for a bribe, Bass Reeves stood apart. His badge was not for sale, his loyalty not in question. He belonged to no man, only to the law and the justice it promised, even on the blood-soaked frontier. Still, questions remained. Could one man tame a wilderness drowning in gunfire? Could Bass Reeves carry the weight of a lawman's oath when his own past was written in chains and fire? As the sun set over the wide plains, the figure of Reeves could be seen riding alone into the horizon, his star glinting in the dying light. For the outlaws hiding in the shadows, the message was clear. Justice had a name, and that name was Bass Reeves. Hunting shadows in Indian Territory. When Bass Reeves first rode out under the star of a deputy U.S. Marshal, the world around him was already against him. The frontier towns whispered doubts. How can a black man uphold the law in a land where even white marshals are gunned down? Outlaws sneered, gambling halls laughed, and even some of his fellow deputies refused to ride at his side. But none of that mattered. Reeves was not a man who lived for the approval of others. He lived by duty, and duty alone. The Indian Territory was no place for the faint-hearted. It stretched out like an endless wound in the land. Dense forests that could swallow a rider, rivers swollen with secrets, and prairies where the wind itself carried the echo of hooves and gunfire. The moment Reeves crossed its borders, he was entering a place where the law was only as strong as the man who carried it, and Bass carried it like no other. The first hunts Reeves' early assignments were not the kind of clean arrests sung about in dime novels. They were brutal, uncertain, and often soaked in blood. His warrants were for killers, rustlers, and desperados who believed they could hide forever in the territory. Reeves proved them wrong. He rode with a Native American posseman at his side, a man who knew the trails and could watch his back in the thick brush. Together they would ride for weeks, sleeping under the stars, eating what they hunted, and following tracks so faint that most men would have lost them within minutes. Bass never lost them. One story tells of Reeves tracking two fugitives through a forest after a thunderstorm. The rain had washed away their footprints, but Bass studied broken branches, disturbed moss, and even the way raindrops had splashed differently on certain patches of soil. Hours later, he found their camp, and by dawn, both men were riding in irons behind him. Word spread fast. Outlaws who once mocked him began to fear him. They gave him a name, the lawman who couldn't be fooled, master of disguise. But Bass Reeves was more than a tracker. He was a strategist, a man who used wit as much as bullets. His disguises became the stuff of legend. In one tale, Reeves went after a pair of brothers wanted for murder. Knowing they would never surrender to a deputy marshal, Bass disguised himself as a ragged tramp. He wore torn clothes, smeared his face with dirt, and carried no gun in sight. When he stumbled into the outlaws' cabin, they laughed at him, offered him food, and let their guard down. That night, while they slept, Reeves slipped his revolvers from the dirt-stained rags, woke them with the cold steel at their throats, and marched them back to Fort Smith. In another case, he pretended to be an outlaw himself, spending days gaining the trust of a gang until the moment came to spring his trap. By the time they realized who he really was, it was too late. To the settlers, Reeves' cleverness was something to admire. To the outlaws, it was something to fear. They never knew if the man beside them in a saloon, the drifter asking for work, or the old tramp on the roadside might suddenly reveal a badge, and the name Bass Reeves. A man of iron principles. Reeves's reputation wasn't only built on his cunning or his unmatched skills with firearms. It was also built on his unshakable principles. He never drank, never took bribes, and never abused his authority. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity whether facing a wealthy rancher or a half-starved bandit. To him, the badge was sacred. He had known chains. He would never allow another man to be enslaved by lawlessness if he could prevent it. Once he arrested his own son for murder. The boy had killed his wife in a fit of rage, and many whispered that Reeves would never bring him in. But Bass did not hesitate. He tracked his son with the same relentless determination he gave to any outlaw. When he brought him in, Reeves's face was like stone, but his eyes burned with a pain few could understand. The frontier held no mercy, and neither did the law. This act shocked the territory. Some called him heartless, others called him incorruptible. For Bass Reeves, it was simple. If the law did not apply to everyone, then it meant nothing. A reputation written in fear. As years passed, Reeves's name spread like wildfire. Children grew up with warnings, behave, or Bass Reeves will find you. Outlaws told each other stories around campfires, trying to guess how he always seemed one step ahead. Some said he had visions. Others believed he carried charms from the tribes that made him invincible. But the truth was no magic. It was patience, discipline, and a will as unyielding as iron. By the time he had been a deputy for a decade, Reeves had made hundreds of arrests. Some he brought in alive, others he left dead on the trail when they drew first. It was said that Bass Reeves killed at least 14 men in gunfights, each time in self-defense. Every bullet he fired carried the weight of law, not vengeance. Yet, behind the cold numbers and statistics, there was the man himself, a former slave, once considered property, now feared as the hand of justice across a land that tried to deny his very humanity. Justice beyond the frontier. But Bass Reeves' journey was not only about enforcing law, it was about redefining what justice could mean on the frontier. In a world where sheriffs often looked away for a bribe, where politics decided who lived and who hanged, Reeves was the rare figure who seemed untouched by corruption. This, perhaps, was why people told stories about him that blurred the line between truth and legend. He was no ordinary marshal. He was something more. The frontier was wild, but even in its wildest corners the outlaws began to learn a hard truth. There was no escaping Bass Reeves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Reeves once again rode into the territory, a silhouette against the endless sky. He carried no songs, no speeches, only the cold steel of justice and the unspoken promise that he would not stop until order had a name. And that name was Bass Reeves. The frontier had a way of testing men, pushing them to their limits, bending them toward darkness, or breaking them altogether. But Bass Reeves was not a man who bent. He was forged, like iron, in the fire of his past, and it was in the blood-soaked lands of the Indian Territory that his legend grew. A law, written in gunpowder. The 1870s and 1880s were years when the Indian Territory seemed less like land and more like a battlefield. Bands of outlaws moved like wolves across the prairies, striking wagon trains, robbing stagecoaches, and vanishing into the wilderness. Many marshals rode in and never rode back. But Bass Reeves? He always came back. One tale tells of an outlaw named Jim Webb, a killer with a quick draw and a cruel laugh. Webb had gunned down men in Texas and Oklahoma, and now he was hiding out near the Canadian River. When Reeves received the warrant, he didn't hesitate. For 3 days, he tracked Webb, through storms, across swollen creeks, and into dense thickets where every twig snap could mean ambush. At last, Reeves rode into Webb's camp. The outlaw smirked when he saw him. "You must be the one they call Bass," Webb said, hand hovering near his pistol. "I hear you're fast. Let's see if it's true." The air was thick with silence. Then, in a flash, guns roared. Webb's bullet grazed Reeves's hat. Reeves's return shot was true. When the smoke cleared, Jim Webb lay still in the dirt. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't glory. It was the law, spoken in gunfire. The man who couldn't be tricked. Bass Reeves's name carried weight, but outlaws were desperate men. Some tried to trick him, to outthink the marshal who always seemed a step ahead. They soon learned that Bass was not a man who could be fooled. In one famous case, he was after two fugitives who had taken refuge at their mother's cabin. Reeves, knowing they would never come quietly, arrived disguised as a weary traveler. He asked for a meal, speaking softly, playing the part of a man with no fight left in him. That night he listened as the brothers boasted of their crimes, laughing at the lawmen who had failed to catch them. Reeves smiled faintly, waiting. When they finally drifted into sleep, he slipped the irons over their wrists. At sunrise, the cabin door opened not to freedom, but to justice. When neighbors asked how a lone marshal had captured the brothers without firing a shot, Reeves only said, "Patience will outlast powder." Tales in the campfire smoke. Stories about Reeves began to spread faster than the prairie fire. Some true, some twisted, some larger than life. Children whispered his name as a warning. Outlaws swore he had supernatural powers. They said he could shoot a coin tossed in the air, strike it before it fell, and holster his revolver before the echo faded. They said no disguise could fool his eyes. No trail could vanish before him. No lie could escape his ears. They said even death itself feared to ride beside him. The truth was simpler and perhaps more terrifying. Bass Reeves was relentless. One outlaw recalled years later, "It didn't matter how far you ran or how deep you hid. If Reeves had your warrant, he would find you. And when he did, there was no bargaining, no mercy, only the law." A code of honor. What set Reeves apart was not only his skill with a gun or his cunning with disguises, it was his code. Bass believed in fairness, even when fairness seemed impossible. He treated prisoners with dignity, giving them food, water, and safe passage back to court. Some outlaws confessed they almost felt more respected in Reeves' custody than they had in their own homes. But he was also uncompromising. One story tells of Reeves confronting a white rancher accused of murder. The man sneered at the idea of surrendering to a black marshal. Reeves stood calm, his revolver steady, and said, "The badge does not see color. It only sees guilt." The rancher lowered his weapon, realizing that behind those words stood a man who would kill him without hesitation if he resisted. Family versus the badge. Perhaps the most painful chapter of Reeves' career came when justice demanded he turn against his own blood. His son, Benny Reeves, had killed his wife in a violent quarrel. The warrant was issued, and every deputy knew who would be asked to serve it. Many thought Reeves would refuse, but he did not. With heavy heart and steady hand, Reeves tracked his son, arrested him, and brought him before the court. Witnesses said his face was carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed a sorrow deeper than words. To Reeves, the badge was not a shield for his family. The law was the law, and no man, friend, foe, or kin stood above it. The act shocked the territory. Some called it cruel, others called it righteous, but all agreed. It proved that Bass Reeves was a man unlike any other. Legends grow in the shadows. By the late 1880s, Reeves had captured more outlaws than any other marshal riding out of Fort Smith. His tally would eventually climb to over 3,000 arrests. Yet, for all his victories, the frontier never grew safe. Like weeds after a fire, new gangs rose from the ashes of the old. Train robbers, cattle rustlers, murderers, they all crossed into Indian territory, and Reeves followed them like a shadow. Outlaws began to whisper of a curse. If Bass Reeves had your name, you were already doomed. Justice carved in dust. One evening, after bringing in a wagon full of chained prisoners, Reeves sat by the fire, silent. A younger deputy asked him, "Marshal, do you ever get tired of chasing shadows?" Reeves looked into the flames, his voice low. A man doesn't choose the shadows he hunts. He chooses the light he rides for. And with that, he leaned back. the weight of the endless frontier still pressing on his shoulders, knowing that the war between law and lawlessness was far from over. But if there was one certainty, it was this: as long as the frontier bred outlaws, Bass Reeves would ride. By the early 1890s, the frontier was changing. Railroads carved paths across the wilderness, towns rose from dust, and the law began creeping into places where it had never dared set foot. But with progress came new breeds of criminals, smarter, bolder, and deadlier. And standing between them and chaos was the same man who had already written his legend in the blood and dust of the Indian Territory, Bass Reeves, the iron rails and the iron men. The coming of the railroad meant fortune for some and ruin for others. For outlaws, trains became moving banks, iron beasts loaded with gold, rifles, and passengers with fat purses. Bands like the Cook Gang terrorized the rails, robbing with a ferocity that left townsfolk trembling. When Judge Parker's court issued warrants, Reeves was the man chosen to serve them. It was said the Cook Gang had eyes everywhere, that even a whisper of pursuit would vanish into the wind. But Reeves did not whisper. He moved with patience, letting rumors and shadows guide him. One cold night, as a train screeched across the prairie, Reeves was already waiting near the tracks. Disguised as a weary drifter, he slipped among the outlaws as they prepared to strike. They joked, laughed, and sharpened knives, unaware that the tall, silent figure beside them carried a badge hidden beneath his coat. When the ambush began, Reeves struck like thunder. His revolvers flashed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "In the name of the law!" Bullets cracked, sparks flew from iron wheels, and when the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay in chains, another in the dirt. The passengers never forgot it. "I thought we were dead men," one said later, "but that Marshal, he was like something out of Scripture, calm as Sunday morning, fierce as Judgment Day." The outlaw who wouldn't die. Not every capture ended in victory so clean. One fugitive, a Cherokee outlaw named Greenleaf, became Reeves's greatest test of endurance. Greenleaf had killed 7 men, and he swore no marshal would ever take him alive. For months, Reeves tracked him, across rivers swollen with rain, through forests where owls cried warnings in the dark, over hills where even the deer ran silent. Every time Reeves closed the gap, Greenleaf slipped away like smoke. At last, the chase ended near Fort Gibson. Reeves rode into a clearing where Greenleaf stood, pistol drawn, eyes blazing. "I know who you are," the outlaw spat, "but I ain't going back." The standoff stretched into eternity. Then came the thunder of gunfire. Greenleaf fired first, his shot tearing Reeves's coat. Reeves's return shot struck true, knocking the gun from Greenleaf's hand. A moment later, the outlaw was shackled, glaring, but beaten. Witnesses swore that when Greenleaf was marched into Fort Smith, he muttered only one thing: "No man should ride like that one. No man but the devil himself." The Ghost of the Territory. By now, Bass Reeves was more legend than man. Parents used his name to frighten children into obedience. "Behave, or Bass Reeves will come get you," they warned. Outlaws claimed he could ride for days without food or water, that he could track a man across bare rock, that he could shoot in the dark and never miss. Even fellow marshals stood in awe. Many admitted quietly that if they had a warrant with their name on it, they'd rather flee the territory itself than face Reeves. But Reeves remained humble. When asked how he captured so many men, he simply said, "I ride straight, and I ride honest." The hanging judge and his iron marshal. Throughout it all, Reeves's greatest ally and harshest burden was Judge Isaac Parker, the man history would call the hanging judge. From his bench in Fort Smith, Parker sentenced men to the gallows by the dozen, declaring, "The law must be enforced. If it requires death, then death it shall be." For Reeves, Parker's words were both a duty and a curse. Each warrant meant danger. Each arrest meant lives altered forever. Reeves carried them out without complaint, but late at night, when campfires burned low, he sometimes wondered if justice and mercy could ever truly walk hand in hand. Still, he never wavered. When Parker died in 1896, Reeves stood at his funeral, hat in hand, eyes hard. "He gave me my path," Reeves said softly, "and I walked it." The last ride of the Old West. As the century turned, the Old West began to fade. Towns grew safer, the wilderness shrank, and the outlaws who once ruled the prairies dwindled like shadows at dawn. But Reeves still rode. Even in his 60s, his hair silver, his back a little bent, he remained a figure to be feared and respected. His reputation was so vast that some criminals, upon learning Bass Reeves carried their warrant, surrendered without a fight. They knew better than to test him. One story tells of a young outlaw who dropped his gun the moment Reeves called his name. "My daddy told me about you," the boy said, trembling. "Said if Bass Reeves comes, don't you dare resist." Reeves simply nodded and said, "Your daddy was a wise man." Shadows and legacy. By the late 1890s, Reeves had brought in more than 3,000 men and killed 14 in the line of duty. He had survived ambushes, storms, and betrayals. He had ridden deeper into danger than most men would dream, and he had returned every time. But the frontier was no longer the same. The legends were ending, and Reeves himself was becoming one. Still, wherever the wind blew through abandoned camps or across empty prairies, the whisper carried on. If Bass Reeves is after you, your days are numbered, because justice might sleep, but it never died, and Bass Reeves was the man who proved it. By the dawn of the 20th century, the frontier that had shaped Bass Reeves was vanishing. Telegraph lines hummed where silence once reigned. Brick courthouses replaced wooden saloons. Children who had grown up fearing outlaws now read about them in dime novels. And yet one man still rode the dusty trails as if time itself refused to unhorse him, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. The old marshal in a New World age had crept upon him slowly, like dusk across the prairie. His hair was snow-white, his stride slower, his eyes a little more tired. But when Bass Reeves mounted his horse, there was no mistaking the figure in the saddle. His presence still carried weight, the outlaw's nightmare, the lawman's lawman. By then, Reeves had served nearly 30 years. His record was staggering: more than 3,000 arrests, 14 men killed in self-defense, countless fugitives brought in alive. He had chased killers across deserts, rivers, and swamps. He had outsmarted thieves who thought themselves cleverer than any lawman. And through it all, Reeves never once flinched. But America was changing. The frontier was closing. The Indian Territory, once a lawless expanse, became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. Judge Parker was long gone, and the court of Fort Smith was no longer the iron fortress of justice it once was. Reeves, too, was a man out of his own time, still respected, but now part of a world drifting into legend. A lawman's greatest test. Even as the new century arrived, Reeves's sense of duty did not wane. In one of the most haunting episodes of his career, he was tasked with serving a warrant for his own son. Benny Reeves, driven by jealousy and rage, had killed his wife. No deputy wanted to approach the case. They all knew what it would mean for Bass. But Reeves, grim and unflinching, insisted, "The law is the law. If I don't uphold it, I'm no better than the men I've hunted." He rode to his son's hiding place, warrant in hand. Benny surrendered quietly, his eyes filled with shame. Bass escorted him to justice, his face carved in stone. Years later, when asked how he could arrest his own blood, Reeves answered only, "Because I am the law. I cannot live any other way." That act cemented his reputation, not just as a great lawman, but as a man of unshakable principle. The last badge. In 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, Bass Reeves was reassigned as a police officer in Muskogee. At nearly 70 years old, he patrolled the streets with the same vigilance he had shown in the wilderness. Locals swore crime dipped the moment Reeves walked a beat. One story tells of two men who attempted to rob a store at night, unaware that the old marshal was nearby. Reeves confronted them, revolver steady, voice calm. Both men dropped their weapons instantly. "We weren't about to test that old man," one later admitted. "He had the look of death in his eyes." But time is relentless, even for legends. After a year of service in Muskogee, Reeves was forced to retire, his health failing. Diabetes claimed the strength that bullets never could. On January 12, 1910, Bass Reeves passed away at the age of 71. The legend beyond the frontier. His funeral drew men and women from across the territory. Former marshals, judges, townsfolk, even ex-outlaws, all came to pay respects. They spoke of a man who had carried justice into the wildest corners of the frontier, who had stood taller than fear itself. Some whispered that Reeves was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, the masked lawman of radio and Hollywood fame. Whether true or not, the story felt right. A man who rode into danger, fearless, and just, who always brought criminals to account. That was Bass Reeves long before it was fiction. The law never sleeps today. His story stands as proof that the Old West was not just a place of outlaws and chaos, but also of men who carried honor like a torch. Reeves. Life was a reminder that justice is not about power or vengeance. It is about doing what is right, no matter the cost. And in that sense, Bass Reeves still rides. His legend echoes in the wind, in the silent bones of ghost towns, in the whistle of trains crossing plains where once he gave chase. He is gone, but his shadow remains, stretching across the history of America like the endless horizon itself. Because the frontier may have closed, but justice never dies. If Bass Reeves's story gripped you, if his battles, his sacrifices, and his unshakable sense of duty stirred something in you, then join us here at Legends of the Wild West. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of outlaws, lawmen, ghost towns, and forgotten legends of America's frontier. Leave a like if you believe stories like Bass Reeves deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was Bass Reeves the greatest lawman who ever lived? Because every legend deserves to be told, and we're here to tell them all.